Good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar about the Southern IPM Center Enhancement Grants. We're pretty excited about the RFA we have for you this year. I've got other members of our grant team with us here today. They're going to be turning their webcams on here in a second. I'm Joe LaForest. I'm one of the co-directors for the Southern IPM Center. I tend to handle a lot of the technology program for the center and also help organize where our different programs are going. Dinesh is also online.
Hi, I'm Dinesh Seth Carley. I'm based at NC State, and I'm co-directors there with Joe. And I primarily handle the financial side of things when it comes to the grants, both pre-award and post-award, as well as managing the reviews and getting the reviews back to all the RFA applicants.
And I'm Jean-Jacques Dubois. I'm at NC State as well. I'm the evaluation specialist for the Southern IPM Center as well as other programs. Thank you.
So the agenda we have for today and going through the RFA, it's all in the RFA. There are no secrets. There are no additional materials. It's what you see in the document that you've probably downloaded from our website. So as we're just going through that, I'm going to go ahead and share my monitor with the RFA on it. It's a fairly direct and straightforward process. It's something that we've tried to make as simple as possible because we want people to understand what our grant panels are looking at when they're going through it. This grant is funded by USDA NIFA through the Crop Protection and Pest Management Program. The IPM centers help coordinate what's going on in the region and foster some of the communication and start up some little programs that actually have some possibilities to go on and do larger things. And that's why we have our grant program, is to fund those projects, working groups, and different things that need to happen to let the southern region really develop things. This year we do have approximately $230,000 that will be available for funding. That's the total pool. And most of the projects end up being somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 for the different types of projects that we have available. And we'll be going into more detail about what those funding limits are for the different types of projects as we go through this. The projects do have start and end dates that have to be between March 1st, 2018 and February 28th, 2019. They are only one-year projects. So good to keep that in mind when working on your proposals. Also, there are indirect costs allowed on these grants of 30% total federal funds or 42.86% of modified total direct cost. You do have some advantages that if your institution has a lower negotiated rate with USDA NIFA, like University of Georgia has a 30% indirect cost rate, modified total direct cost, with NIFA for extension projects, there'd be an additional 12.86% of that money that's actually available for the project that we're working on. In terms of who can apply, it's a pretty broad range of individuals. That private individuals, institutions, four-year universities, businesses, commodity organizations, government, non-government, all eligible to apply. And these projects are all focused on integrated pest management, working with the systems to find the best solutions that are economically feasible, effective, and environmentally compatible. The projects are also within the states listed in the RFA in the Southeast region. While the project may extend beyond that, working with other partners outside the state, the project director has to be from within the Southeast region. In addition to the funding that's available, we also offer support to help project directors with portions of their project. There's a lot of technology that's already available through either some of the stuff that I work here with at University of Georgia, through the Bugwood Network, through what the Southern IPM Center has offered for technology services, that if you need that for your project, we'll support you in that, provision you with what you need so you can spend more time focusing on what your actual deliverables for the project are. We kind of like to say, let the biologists handle the biology and technology support that. We are technology support, so biologists don't have to. We also have support with evaluation, that if you have questions on evaluation, Jean-Jacques, who you saw previously and who's going to talk a little bit later, provide some feedback on how you're looking to evaluate your programs, what will actually give us some good measures to look at. A few years ago, we changed our funding to an outcome-based model, that we want to see outcomes from your projects. We want to see how it's actually having an effect. So we're looking to measure that, and Jean-Jacques is very good about helping people tease out how they can measure that consistently. As mentioned, the purpose of this is to help the development and adoption of IPM in the southern region. You can see the overall mission of the IPM Center here, and what we're looking at is finding ways that we need to have timely responses to issues that are coming out, address those things that are really a priority for the region, and focus on solving existing problems. With that, as you're developing your RFA or your proposal, it's a good idea to have stakeholder priorities, economic information, other things that you can cite that show that the problem you're working on is something of importance to the region. That's something that our panels value quite a bit. There are several different types of projects that are possible to put into an enhancement grant. The first two are a little bit similar, that you have, first of all, seed projects, which if you have something you want to get some baseline data for, try out a new technique, test the feasibility of something. Seed projects are a great way to get started on something, get some basic information, and hopefully be able to use that for larger funding that would come through the Applied Research and Development Program, or ARDP, or maybe an AfriCare project for the critical research and extension. Seed projects really are getting that initial kernel of things done so that you can take it on to additional work. Capstones are similar in that there's something that's happened, but you have something else, just a little something that if you did this would really help extend this effort, promote adoption, and carry it on. So capstone projects and seed projects are very similar in the scope of what they're looking at. They're each for about $30,000 total cost. That helps with all the materials or postdocs or graduate students or whatever's needed to carry out those projects. The third category of grants we have are the working group grants, which are an interesting hybrid between, well, the way it's developed has become an interesting hybrid. This provides additional funds that if you just need to get a group together to meet, if there's a high priority issue in the region regarding resistance of a new insect or disease or weed to a particular class of pesticides, or there's a new threat that just came in from a new invasive species, you can get a group of people together just to hold a meeting, just to coordinate, talk, and set priorities for what has to happen in the next few years. What we found with our existing working groups is that when they come in, they can really get down to some ideas on paper about how the group needs to work together, and it puts them in a great position to plan for additional projects and additional grants. Pardon the train in the background. For some of our working groups, they actually extend out beyond just that initial meeting, and they actually carry on a project that group already has enough momentum, they already have enough organization that they can also carry on a project in addition to their team building activities. So the team building activities are generally looking at about $10,000, and then an additional project of $30,000 for a total project of $40,000. Again, all within 1 year. We do look at new and existing working groups, and how we look at this, that if you're a group that has just formed up, doesn't already have the organization, hasn't set priorities, we urge you to strongly consider just going for $10,000 in that first year. That allows you to make sure you have a good foundation beneath you before proceeding on to tackle some fairly large projects. If you're already an existing working group, but not one that's been funded by the Southern IPM Center, you could come in, apply for, yes, the $10,000 to meet, but then go on for that additional $30,000 to carry on a project. It's fairly flexible in how that works. You don't have to have been funded by us previously in order to be considered an existing working group. We just want to know that the group has some organization, has been working together for a while. The projects that are going to be submitted this year, we have a fairly good deadline of November 3rd, 2017, so that from release of the RFA, we had approximately 8 weeks for people to work on their proposals. So at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and that is Eastern Time, good to note for those on Central, we will shut down the acceptance of any more materials in the grant system, and everything's as it is. And that's what will go on to our grant panels. So mark on your calendars now, Friday, November 3rd, 2017 at 5 o'clock is when our final deadline is. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jean-Jacques Dubois, who's going to talk a little more about the enhancement grant application process and how our RFA has been set up for your proposal narrative.
Joe, you might want to cover number 1, the proposal components, and I would pick it up at logic model, right? Do you need to cover anything on the proposal submission form? Or is that self-explanatory?
I took that as fairly self-explanatory, but since you brought it up, there are a number of different forms that an applicant will fill out throughout filling out their application. All of them are downloadable through our online system that you can find the links throughout the RFA. The first 2 forms cover a lot of just the background information for who the people are that are applying for it, what the funding limits are. We also have the cover and assurance form, which are just standard forms that your grant office is probably familiar with. We do have videos online, and there are links throughout the document showing where those videos are. If you have any questions about what forms are, what information has to go in any places, you can always contact us with that information.
Very good. So I'm going to cover the logic model and narrative part of the RFA. Joe, are you giving me the screen? Okay, very good. So this is the logic model. One very important thing to remember or to be aware of when preparing your proposal is that there's essentially a perfect match, a perfect alignment in the structure of the logic model, narrative, and very importantly, the scoring sheet the panelist, the independent panelist, will use to score your proposal, right? So the way you need to look at this is really look at logic model and narrative at the same time as essentially the same thing, a long version and a short version, and keep in mind the scoring sheet that panelists are going to use to see just how important those different points are. Under both logic model and narrative, the elements of the logic model are very clearly explained: situation, inputs, outputs, outcomes, and you should refer to that, or else call me if you have any question at all. You have 2 templates available to you for the logic model. The only difference is that one of them is filled out with examples that, of course, you would delete and replace with your own project, right? With things relevant to your own project. But for added convenience, you have even a blank one. And exactly what goes where within this template is explained in the RFA very clearly. Just in case there is a little bit of difference, here, which is that since you're trying to convince the panelists that this is going to be a very useful project, that the project that you're proposing, we are asking you to give us all the way to long-term outcomes. That is, outcomes that might happen, that might occur in the 5 or 10-year range. Obviously, these projects are only 1 year, so we do not expect that you will see even medium-term outcomes, but you should fill that out because the panel needs to know that the sort of outcomes you expect in the longer term. In the narrative, you will need to fill out a table with essentially some dates and people responsible for some of the outputs and how you're going to measure outcomes, things like that. In that case, when it comes to actually sort of the planning part of the narrative, we do not expect you to tell us exactly how you're going to measure the long-term outcome, but we do expect you to tell us, or to put in to tell the panel the short term. Now, very importantly, there's one more thing that matches this basic structure, right, of a situation, input, outputs, outcomes, and it is the reporting. You do have access to the reporting form, the reporting template that you will need to fill out at the end of your 1-year project, and it might be very useful to you to already look at that reporting form, because it lays out clearly what you are going to be expected to measure as you go along. So do use that as guidance when writing, for example, your evaluation part of the narrative. Very good. Everywhere I'm looking here at situation. So in other words, the current problem, the sort of definition of the problem that you're trying to address, right? There, as in all other parts of the narrative and of the logic model, we expect, you would do well to put numbers, and if possible at all, citations. We don't mean citations in the academic sense. We mean that if there are priorities that have been defined and put on paper by grower groups or whoever your stakeholders are, you absolutely should use those under situation when describing what's called the situation, the problem that you are dealing with. What else could I think of? I think that's pretty much, yeah, that's it at some point. If there will be time for questions at the end, and we'll be glad to answer them. So, Joe, how do I give you the screen back?
I've got it.
Okay, very good.
So thank you, Jean-Jacques, for going through the main parts of the RFA. Like Jean-Jacques said, a lot of this was made to line up so that it was fairly simple for people to follow through and how this all comes together. So that when you're looking at the evaluation sheet that you see up on my page now, you should see directly from the sections in the RFA exactly what the panelists are going to be looking at. So there's really no questions in terms of judging it and reading what you have there. Do you think someone, another scientist, although they might be an entomologist or a plant pathologist or a weed scientist or an agronomist, they may not be in your direct background, so you need some information there to help them understand the basis for it, but can they find the information they're looking for? So we're hoping that's lined up pretty well. Probably the biggest thing we've done to help people out with this is the last page of the RFA is our contact information. If at any time during the process you have questions about the RFA, or if a project fits, or where a project should go, or what information would be helpful to include, you can contact any of us. We've got our information there so you can reach out to us. Both Dinesha and I take a lot of different calls on what projects people are looking at. Last year, I think I had several people just call me up with a list of ideas and say, what do you think about these? Which ones do you think are most appropriate? And, you know, we give some good feedback where we can and tell them how we think it can fit. If you're finding out that you're going to be needing to use some technology and want to use some of the services that are available, let us know ahead of time. That would be through me, so we can make sure that whatever capacity you need will be available for you to help you with your project. If you have any questions on this right now, if you can type them into the chat so that we can answer them. Like we said, we've taken a lot of effort to make this as straightforward of an RFA as possible. If you've applied for a USDA NIFA grant in the past several years, you've seen logic models before. You probably have tried to figure out and maybe now understand a little better how they come together. What we have is based largely on that, putting that first so that what you're going to do makes logical sense to get the outcomes that we're looking for. So thank you all for attending. We'll take any questions you have. I'm still not seeing any come in the chat. Wait a little bit longer just because I know some of you may be slow typers. I know one question we've had in the past, and Dinesha, you have the best answer for it because you deal with all the finances. What are allowable costs under our enhancement grants? I mean, graduate students, postdocs, food, meetings, what are we allowed to put on these things?
So, Joe, that's a great question, and the short answer is yes to all of those things. As long as it is in your budget, we tend to have a line item where those costs are allowable. So we can fund graduate student stipends, and we can even fund food if you're presenting a workshop and you need to work through lunch, for example. We just have to make sure all of those items are appropriately. The one thing I can say we are unable to pay for, and that's pretty much across the board for many of these federal grants, and that is computers. Now, that doesn't mean it's completely off the table, and if you need a computer for your program, please feel free to call me or email me, and we can talk about how we can make that happen in a way that is appropriate for both your situation and what is allowable by our granting agency. But we can pay for equipment, again, as long as it's justified. Graduate student stipends, technician stipends, faculty stipends, materials and durable goods, any of those things typically are very appropriate to ask for.
We do have one question. Are there any page limits in the narrative? And the answer is yes, there are. Throughout the narrative, you're going to see different things like limit 1 page for the logic model, or logic model discussion, limit 1 page, problem and justification, limit 2 pages. We try to give page limits for the different sections because several of the sections are very, very simple. It's meant to be straightforward, and we're trying to help our grant panel in order to get through a lot of these proposals. Last year we had 37 proposals come in, out of which we funded 9. So it's a lot of work for our panel to get through it, and it helps some of our writers actually be fairly concise. But do check that each section has its different section, has a different line for what the page limit is on that. What we generally instruct our panel to do if something doesn't match the page limits, there's obviously points that get taken off when they're judging because you didn't follow the instructions. But also at a certain point, they stop reading because it's beyond the page limit. We also have a question, can we request consultant fees?
All right. You know, I don't ever remember seeing that in a grant, although I don't see why not. Again, as long as it's perfectly appropriate for the grant, and if you justify it appropriately, I think that we certainly have a line item in our larger grant that allows that. So short answer, yes.
Okay. I think other tips we can give, in case there are some questions still coming in, when looking at your timeline of events, try to keep those timelines and what things are going to happen within the period we mentioned before, that they need to be between March 1st and February 28. If you start mentioning other stuff in your proposal beyond those times and say that's really where the impact's going to come, the panel's going to look at that and say, well, that's lovely, but it's outside the grant, so you're not going to be measuring that. What are you doing? Try to think of other things that have come up over the years. Letters of support, very, very valuable from the people that the program will actually affect. Jean-Jacques?
Yes, as far as the long-term, the impacts or outcomes beyond the 1 year period, you do mention them in the logic model. Should be there anyway. Also, very important midterm, mid-range, or midterm outcomes would be further grants that you might want to pursue based on the results of what you do under this one. That would be of great interest to the panelists. If you see this as a springboard towards seeking out larger grants, please do so. I mean, please do so.
Something else I'll mention while we're here, this occasionally will come up, particularly as the deadline for the enhancement grant proposal reaches closer, is that all applications must be submitted online through our system, and everybody will have easy access to that via the sipmc.org website. And so all documents for the grant that need to be considered for the grant must be submitted to that system. So if you send me something or Joe something, that is not acceptable. However, if you're having technical difficulties, and I encourage everyone to apply early, right? So that if you have issues, we will have staff standing by to help with those issues, and we'll do the best that we can. But at the cutoff date, no matter what issues we've been having, we're still going to have to make that a hard and fast deadline. So if you can start that process early and you have trouble, let us know so that we can help you before the deadline is reached.
Well, no further questions have come in, so I'm going to assume at this point everyone's pretty well sated. Again, thank you all for attending this webinar about our RFA. We look forward to seeing all the wonderful projects come in and do what we can to help support development of some new IPM technologies and help facilitate more communication. So thank you all for joining us.